Community Sales Manager here at Politics and Prose, and welcome to PMP Live this evening from Politics and Prose, DC's premier independent bookstore and cultural hub. And before we get to the main show, as it were, a few announcements. First and most important, thank you. And thank you for continuing to support us by logging in tonight for what I know is going to be an amazing conversation. And thank you for supporting booksellers throughout this weird time. And do yourself a huge favor, and do us a huge favor, and do folks a huge favor, and do everyone a huge favor by buying a copy of The Black Joke, topic of this evening's talk, from PMP Today. It came out this week, so it's hot off the press, very hot. And we'll be putting it in the order link in the chat box throughout the evening's talk. So you can order it online to be sent to you wherever you are, or if you're here in DC, you can fetch it at the store. And while you're on the website, because you will be on the website buying the book, take a moment to just cruise around and find out about some of the extra stuff we do. You know us for books, but we do things like the Book a Month Club, where we curate books for you to show up at your door. You don't even have to think about it. We choose them for you based on what you tell us. Or we also run a speakers bureau for private businesses and organizations and institutions, where we bring in notable authors to your business to talk about their books and their work. So back to tonight. For those of you who are PMP Live veterans, you know that your mic is on mute, and that the best way to get questions to our panelists tonight is to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. Don't put them in the chat, but if you put them in the Q&A box, Damon can find them right quick. And we are also providing closed captions on demand if you click on the CC link at the bottom of your screen as well. So on to the show. Tonight's moderator is Damon Young, whose debut memoir, What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Blacker, a memoir and essays, won the 2020 Thurber Prize for American Humor and Barnes & Noble's 2019 Discover Award. It was also longlisted for the PEN American Diamonstein Spiegel-Vogel Award, nominated for both an NAACP Image Award and a Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and is a Krauss Essay Prize nominee. NPR, which named it one of the best books of 2019, called it, quote, an outstanding collection of nonfiction. Damon's also the co-founder of the culture blog Very Smart Brothers, and was a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, a columnist for GQ, and has written for The Atlantic, Esquire, Time Magazine, New York Magazine, The Undefeated Ebony, and the Pittsburgh Gazette. And he comes to us from Pittsburgh tonight. He will be in conversation with the real star of tonight's show, A.E. Rooks. Rooks self-describes as always hoping to be a student of history, though that hasn't stopped her from studying anything else. She's a two-time Jeopardy champion, kind of wicked cool, with completed degrees in theater, law, and library and information science, and forthcoming degrees in education and human sexuality. Her intellectual passions are united by what the past can teach us about the present, how history shapes our future, and above all, really interesting stories like The Black Joke. All right, guys, up to you.
Hello. Thank you for the introduction, Wendy, and welcome everyone joining us on this fine Thursday evening. I hesitated a bit when saying Thursday because it feels this is the Fridiest Thursday I think that I've experienced in months.
Word.
Have you felt that?
I did not know what day it is. To be honest, if my planner didn't tell me it was Thursday, I would have been, I don't know if it's Friday or Wednesday or what the heck day it is, because at this point, days have no meaning and time is endless.
The only thing that keeps that continuity for me is having kids and because they're in school. But if they weren't in school, then it would be like, you remember that scene? Have you seen Interstellar?
Yes.
And the scene at the end where Matthew McConaughey is just like going through the black hole, the event or whatever, and all that's what time would be for me.
Yeah, I feel like that. That seems accurate to my experience.
Just almost like you're slitting through an event horizon at all times.
I'm with that.
So how are you doing?
I'm doing, it's kind of a crazy week, but doing great, rolling with the homies. talking
Okay.
about the slave trade constantly. But what are you gonna do?
Always fun.
It's super fun. It's the funnest. Nothing more fun than discussing human trafficking on an industrial scale. Delightful.
And I want to tell everyone too that my children are still very, very, very much awake and eating dinner at this time. So you may hear them and they may join us for some parts of this conversation. So I'm just letting you know that. Give me a heads up.
Do my best to stay all ages.
Yeah. So there was a question that I wanted to kind of lead up to before we got to the Q&A, but I think I want to ask you this first. Okay. Yes. Okay. I made an editorial change.
I'm into it.
Run of show change. All right. So in the past several years, we have been victim to various reboots. I mean, you have the Sex and the City reboot. You have, the trailer for the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air reboot. What else? I went to see a Best Man reboot, the Best Man Holiday. And I love Malcolm Lee, he's my homie, but that didn't need to be a movie. All the IP from Marvel, and now we're at the superheroes that don't even have superpowers, just people who just have trauma and good aim.
That's
right.
That's the soul of a character, my friend. I feel like there are many westerns.
I'm not interested. I'm not as interested in seeing a series about someone who could just run a little fast and has a nice costume.
I don't know, if it were FloJo, I might watch that.
All right, maybe FloJo, maybe Sha'Carri, maybe someone like that, but not a superhero who is just an athletic human. All the IP from Star Wars. Anyway, we have all this stuff that exists. Why hasn't there been a movie about this book, about this story? Because I'm reading this and it's cinematic. You have all of these different factors. You have, people who are literally, doing good, and you have all the drama of the different crews interacting with each other. I just see this as something that would be extremely cinematic. I picture Chris Nolan's Dunkirk, a similar sort of story where you could have shifting, perspectives with different time and whatnot. So what's up? Why isn't this a movie?
I have a number of potential theories on that, but I think the most apt and prominent one would be that it is not a story that makes folks look good. It's not one of those like, oh man, look at those heroic actions of those legendary white folks just saving us from themselves. There doesn't really have that kind of a moment in it, because when you read the story, it becomes a situation where you're like, man, it seems like Britain kind of screwed the pooch on that one, and then from an American perspective, there's not exactly a great US sort of entree point, right? This isn't really a United States story. And we tend to like stories about us a lot of the time. So I think that if you combine the fact that, especially in the United States, there's not a good tie-in, because although the United States very much did have a domestic slave trade, they had, at least in theory, ended the international slave trade back in 1808. So it had continued illegally, obviously, up until the Civil War. But technically it was over. And in Britain, they do talk about this sort of, it becomes a situation where, yay, Britain ended the slave trade. And it's like, Britain really participated hard in the slave trade. So maybe we don't want to take credit for, doing something that we basically made as bad as possible. Because at the time that the Black Joke is sailing, at the time that they passed that law, Britain is the biggest slave trading nation of all nations. So I think that it's a difficult story for someone to tell where, unfortunately, it's a difficult story for someone to tell where white folks and powers that be in those particular contexts come out looking like they did the right thing, because they didn't, mostly. So I think there are stories about like the abolition part, like getting up to
Mhm.
the law, but the suppression part, that's not cute, because once they actually put their back into it, which is after 1848, they managed to accomplish suppression, most suppression within about 10 years. So what happened, Britain? You know, and nobody wants to watch that movie. At least nobody British. I do, but
I would watch that movie. Like, and again, I'm it doesn't even necessarily have to be a white filmmaker. It could be someone like Steve McQueen who you know, who addresses this and has the nuance and has the skill set to be able to tell this comprehensive story, you know, that again doesn't, you know, shows that there was evil also with this, you know, with this entity that freed people, that that ultimately did good, but there was evil, there was greed, there was just all types of just all the messy shit that went into the, you know, the capture and the selling of enslaved of captured Africans. And again, I just picture this as being extremely, you know, not necessarily cinematic in terms of something I would want to go see, even though I would, but something that, you know, seems like it would be a very interesting piece of IP. And I guess that brings me to my other question is, and this is more of a statement than a question. Don't you hate when people say that?
it's more of a comment than a question.
More of a comment than a question. But I mean, I was both annoyed and embarrassed that I hadn't heard of this before.
I completely resonate with that 100%, because part of the, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I consider, you know, myself relatively well read, and you know, I know about things. I'm a professor. I'm paid to know things and talk to people about the things that I know. But this was my first interaction with this story in any context.
Yeah, I don't think that's uncommon at all. It certainly was my experience. I am not going to front, lie, or do anything like that. I like to think of myself as a reasonably well-educated person, right? At least have the papers for it, so that's something. And
yeah, you have. I don't think I've read a bio where someone had, you know, 3 degrees and then like 3 forthcoming degrees also. Two. Okay, I'm sorry. 2 forthcoming degrees.
I'm so close. But yeah, so I didn't know, you know, and my parents were very like, you will learn Black history at home. I have been watching Eyes on the Prize, all 10 to 12 episodes, depending on how you count it, since I was 6, you know, like it was like, I felt like I knew my Black history, but what I knew was my Black American history, it turned out. And also I think a big part of that, honestly, is like the way that systems of slavery really functioned, right? Because here in the States, we just had a completely different situation going on because of the fact that the population was almost balanced gender-wise when it came to picking cotton, as opposed to with sugar, it was usually at least 80% male, if not exclusively. So the even availability of natural increase was just a non-starter, right? If you're on a sugar plantation. But so then you have a situation where you don't have as much incoming traffic, right? You don't have bodies sort of constantly being replaced in the same way, but you do have this really robust intrastate traffic, right? And so I think that we get caught up in what happened here. And I don't think that there's nothing necessarily anything wrong with that, especially if nobody's trying to tell us, which I really think is the other big part of this, is that I don't know what happened at your school, but at every school I went to, including taking AP US History and AP World History, the slave trade was about 5 seconds on the way to something else, right? And then when it comes to what actually happens in there, you know, and that's part of the reason I really wanted to highlight Professor Mustakim's book so much in many ways, is because it's one of the only books I've ever, Slavery at Sea is one of the only books I've ever read, besides Marcus Rydiker's The Slave Ship, basically, that talks about what actually happened on actual ships between point A and point B. And I like that kind of stuff was just super, super fascinating to me. But honestly, I stumbled on this through W.E.B. Du Bois's Harvard dissertation frankly, which is freely available online. Everyone, you can go find that. It was in 1894, and I believe it's called The Suppression of the Atlantic Slave Trade, or something very close to that. And his stats are unreal. And like when you think about like when he was doing that work, it just makes you go like, oh my God, thank you so much for doing this, because he goes through and lists like every incarnation of every law that was happening in the United States. But he also talks about what was happening outside the United States. And that's when my perspective on this, I think, really changed. And I realized how much I didn't know.
W.E.B. Du Bois had some of the best infographics that you will ever see. Yes, and you consider that they were made, 100 years ago, right? And these were amazing.
I have a book
pieces of art. They should be in museums.
Absolutely.
These things that he created.
They're phenomenal. If folks have not seen W.E.B. Du Bois's infographics,
like Google when you're done with this, Google his infographics, because that will take you down a rabbit hole of joy. Just looking at all the colors he used and the different shapes and the geometry. It's truly astounding. And to answer your question about what I learned in school, it was similar to what your experience. I mean, I got my Black history from my parents, also watching Eyes on the Prize and Roots and what else, and reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. And my parents actually took me to see Malcolm X I think on my 11th birthday or my 12th birthday. It was my parents were awesome. Like I can't even front, like I'm not even gonna try to like qualify it as being cool, but my parents did a whole lot for me in that regard. But if I just use school as my source of history, my source of knowledge, then there was slavery was bad. And then Abraham Lincoln came through like on an Amazon truck and went from door to door and like delivered freedom to everybody. And then that was it. Like even things like that are relatively relatively universalized knowledge right now, like Juneteenth. I had no idea about Juneteenth until I was in my 20s.
Oh, see, right? I lived in Texas as a kid, so Juneteenth I was surprised when everybody else discovered Juneteenth.
I was already, probably out of college. So I'm in my 20s, and again, I'm born and raised Pittsburgher, and that was a thing that I had never. And if you don't know, if no one tells you,
right?
And so I'm glad you brought the part about the W.E.B. Du Bois, because that was going to be one of my follow-up questions is what drew you to this story in particular, right? Like, what was it about this story that made you want to dive so deep and write a book about it?
I think part of it is that like every time I thought I sort of had a handle on this story, it was like, oh, but wait, did you hear about, and so then suddenly you have like 300 sources or articles that you downloaded from like random places, and you're like, what am I doing here? But the Black joke itself, I think the thing that I like about it, or find so interesting about it and its story, is the fact that we have a ship that goes from being a slaver, essentially, it is participating in the precise traffic that we are talking about, readily going to Brazil. It did at least 6 successful trips, I believe, thanks to Dinza Lutini. Gonna shout out all of our academics here, who wrote a really great article about, it's called I believe, The Slaving Brig Henrietta and Her Evil Sisters, and it really goes into a lot of the detail about sort of Black joke's pre-Black joke life. But then you end up in a situation where, so the ship turns around, okay, and then our first captain, so they capture it, cool. The guy who captures it is not the guy who ends up, so he's got it, yeah, so it's Colonel Collier, and so he's got it, he's bought it, he's gonna rename it. We won't even get into what the name means because it will no longer be all ages if I do, but he's going through all of this, and each person becomes more interesting. Collier is the guy who is in part responsible, and I do mean responsible as in did the naval bombardment of Britain's final takeover of the Gulf. So like, oh, Middle Eastern policy in Britain, thank Commander Collier, right? And then we move, Commodore rather, and then we move on. The next guy is one of the only non-rich, well, I mean, he might have been rich, but non-titled in any way, shape, or form people to even get a promotion to this level in this period because it was that hard to do. And his dad was a wine merchant, right? When everybody else's dads are like lords or admirals or at least captains or something, or at least they got a brother in the service and he sort of has no one, but then he's incredibly lucky. And you're like, well, that's fun. And then the next guy, his ship, his last berth had a situation where there was an entire homosexual sub-community, right, operating on the ship. 10% of the ship's complement, meaning that 25% of the ship's complement ends up involved in the court martial. And you're just like, what's next? You know, and then like you get like suddenly there's a pandemic and suddenly somebody's calling a beard a state of tropical undress. And you're like, I don't even know what that means, but I'm intrigued. And like at that point, I was done. And so I think all those little things, and then I think biggest of all might be that it is a very clear signpost of the fact that things can go better if we make them go better. But if we don't, you're going to get the status quo for another 30 years. Enjoy that, you know, because this was a really big historical turning point that could have been and wasn't.
And again, just what you said in the last 45 seconds speaks to how cinematic it can possibly be with all the different stories, court martials and queer communities and all of that are part of this massive story, right?
I didn't even get to the part where the guy is buddies with Charles Darwin. That's the fifth captain. What?
And then you could have some stunt casting, you know, like Charles Darwin is played by, I don't know, just Kenneth Branagh, like randomly.
I was like, I'm realizing in this
Kristen Bell.
What Charles Darwin actually.
Tom Hardy.
Yeah, Tom Hardy can play anybody. Let's just go with Tom Hardy.
Okay, let's go with Tom Hardy. Yeah, we could do a Bane Baldwin or Bane, you know, Darwin sort of thing, sort of matched up.
Why not? I mean, it was young Darwin, I think, at that point. You know, he's going out, learning things, becoming a baby abolitionist. That's interesting stuff. That book is Darwin's Sacred Cause. See, I'm remembering all my sites. They're in here.
You know, one of the one of the common and I guess somewhat annoying misnomers about slavery and about the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, is that resistance was minimal. And, you know, you see those god awful fucking, you know, I'm not my ancestors shirts that some of us wear sometimes. And, you know, the reality is that there was resistance throughout the entire process. Sometimes the resistance didn't lead to actual freedom. Sometimes the resistance was just resistance for resistance sake, you know, in terms of hunger strikes or, you know, just certain small things that you know, that enslaved people would do in order to, you know, just irritate or just retain, you know, whatever measures of their humanity they need to do. And so this is another one of those stories. You know, it's a complicated story, and it's not just a story about resistance, but there is resistance, and there are. And I don't think we mentioned this yet. There were Black, you know, members or, you know, Black people who were part of this effort.
Yeah, and it's
many Black people who were part of this effort.
It's a multicultural Black cast, actually.
Yeah.
Which people are like, what? And it's like, nah, there are a ton of Black people here, but they're just not always where you expect them. We know that one member, right, of the Black Joke was Black for sure, because he's, you know, remembered posthumously as like a free African cook. So thanks, we got it. And so go Joseph Francis, you know, getting one in for the team or whatever. And so he's the guy in El Almirante action who gets the chain into the guns, and then they shoot it at El Almirante and it cuts one of the masts. I think the actual quote is as if cleaved by an axe. So that's pretty dramatic. And it's also very heavy chain, so good for him. And usually, not always, but usually if there was only one free Black or African, because there were already Black Londoners and English folk as well at this point. But if there's only one, that person was probably the cook, but not always. And if you go back a little further, when they were, more press gangs and like everybody's basically fighting because Napoleon, you end up with a situation where I think I pointed out that, who wrote about this? Ray Costello writes a book about this, where there were at least 10 Black sailors serving alongside Nelson at Trafalgar on the Victory. So there were plenty of Black sailors. There are also sailors of all sort of colors and stripes, because Britain was already like, oh, you want to fight for us? And by want to, are you going to? Great, come on. And they also would have considered themselves even more diverse than we would have now, because to them, the difference between Scots versus Irish versus English would have been a much more, and maybe it's more pronounced in Britain than it is to us Americans regardless, but would have been a much bigger thing as well, and a bigger difference. So there's tons of Africans, and then that's totally setting aside, so possibly not Africans, also Africans, and also there's at least the crewmen, or AKA the crew, which is what they should be called, but British folk were like, no, it's cute. We love a pun. So they end up bastardizing KRU to KROOMEN. And then you end up with these guys who actually do a ton of like the grunt work on the ship. They were paid, well, actually they were almost paid equivalently, equality versus equity, right? They actually had the same rate of pay, and the head crewman would have a higher rate as if he were a petty officer, but they were not paid prize money, because they weren't officially part of the Royal Navy. So this big supplemental aspect of catching all of these like slave ships is to get the money as a reward for them being captured, which crewmen didn't get any parts of. And Collier tried to get that changed, and I believe they eventually did. But at one point, there was a ship, the Plumper, which is, bless it, oh, the Plumper, poor thing. The HMS Plumper at one point was staffed by, I want to say, approximately 5 white folk, and literally the rest of the sailing crew was crewmen, and that was it. So they were 100% relying on Black bodies to do a lot of this work, even on British ships.
Yeah.
It's not great.
Yeah, it's not. And, you can't help but think, we have the story, we have all these stories, right? And, we're existing at a time when, there is a political movement that is attempting to suppress our history, the actual things that happen, because they make white people feel bad about their history, about their ancestry, or whatever. And one of the, I guess, the more nefarious parts of this movement is, when you step back and you realize that there are stories that still haven't even been told. Stories that still haven't been, or maybe have been told, but on a smaller scale, that haven't been mainstreamed, right? And so there's so much more that we could be educating our children about, educating ourselves about, and the little bit of stuff that we are already doing is trying to get, people are trying to, get that outlawed. And I don't know. Now, obviously, you were done with your book, and you were done with your research. I guess before this, this 1619 spurred move to, to get critical race theory out of every classroom, even though it's not in any classrooms.
Which, I mean, if
in the elementary classroom.
If your 5-year-old is in law school, good for your 5-year-old. I am personally impressed. Like, please, you should be shouting that. Like, yes.
I'm wondering,
taking CRT. Amazing.
I'm wondering if that, if you would have, let's say, if you would have done any of your research now, if the political, I guess, atmosphere in America today would have had any impact on how you did your work, or how you felt about your work while you were doing it.
That's such an interesting question. I think the answer to how I did it is no. It might have changed how I wrote the introduction and the conclusion, though. Like some of the ideas that I teased out, I think I might have gone even further with that and sort of said even more in that way because we're talking about something more specific that's sort of happening in this moment. But like, I firmly believe that one, obviously, I clearly think that is all nonsense with the CRT in schools and whatnot. And two, we're already, like you said, we're already not learning about the slave trade essentially, right? This story is not being told to us as a common story. Like it's definitely there, but it's not one that we're passing on to the kids actively, right? And I think that thinking about that then makes me go, well, doesn't mean we shouldn't, right? And so when I look at a ship where, like, if the example that I'm trying to take away from the Black joke or help other people take away from the Black joke is like, just because it's messy or difficult or contentious or gross or not going to be done properly or whatever is not ever an excuse to not do the right hard thing, you know? And I think that this ship really typifies that, right? In the bad sense, in the sense that look what happens when you don't do the right hard thing. But also, I think that speaks to us, and I think that's part of the reason that folks don't want us to know this stuff, right? Honestly, if we're gonna get a little like tin-hatty about it or whatever, I think part of that is because when people are not told that, you know, Lincoln came along throwing Amazon packages like Santa with freedom inside, you know, like when that doesn't happen, then you begin to ask the question, well, wait, how did they do it then? Yeah. And then the answer becomes, oh, you mean decades of sustained campaigning at multiple levels of society, even when it was a really unpopular idea? Would that be useful for anyone today? You know, and then suddenly we can look back to examples of, yeah, you know what, it is going to take a long time, but don't give up because it always takes a long time. And yeah, it is going to be extremely annoying and people are going to fight you every step of the way and possibly kill you. That happens too every single time, basically. And so I think that there is something that we do very much lose when our conversations about how change is achieved begin with, you know, and then one day it happened. You know, and also end there.
Yeah, and then and it's always a great man, and it's always a man. You know, it's always, you know, a singular force that through sheer force of will and moral certitude, you know, was able to achieve this thing, whether it's Lincoln, whether it's MLK, and not a movement that, you know, not just decades, centuries, centuries of resistance and starting with enslaved Africans but you know, even, you know, politicians, and I'm gonna call me first.
But yes, I'm with you. Definitely starting with enslaved Africans. And this is, I forgot to say this earlier, and I definitely want to, because I want to highlight this, because you had mentioned that rebellion and revolt was a lot more common than I think we think of it. And that was another thing that definitely came up for me that I did not realize shipboard revolts, where it happened in, I think one source said upwards of a quarter of journeys sort of in the slave trade probably had some sort of shipboard revolt. Does not mean it was successful. Oh, but they had one. And the one that happens in this book, I wonder whether or not the folks who did it consider it a success, because compared to their options, I might. Because rather than ending up as apprentices in Jamaica or like bound to the land in Sierra Leone, as far as the British were concerned, they were like, please get out, just go to the mountains. We never want to see you again. Please don't make trouble, just go, you know? And I think that's kind of great. Like, good job, guys, you did it. So yeah, so I wanted to put that out there because I forgot to say it earlier.
Okay. We're going to start with some of the questions, and also too, you know, our conversation will continue, and, you know, some of these questions might actually, you know, lead to more questions that I have for you. So, and please, if you have any more, audience, if you have any questions, please just share them, or just not a question, but a statement. We want to hear from everybody. Okay. Okay. The first one from Kimberly Reed. I cannot wait to read the book. How do we get our young people interested in learning more about our history, especially since it appears to not being taught in schools, elementary and high school?
Well, that's, to me, I think history is interesting. Like, honestly, I think that we do history a disservice by describing it as uninteresting, because there's stuff that happens in this that if I had said this is a fiction book and also the HMS African, people would be like, never in a million, girl. There is no way that that actually happened on a ship. But of course it did, right? So I think letting history be more than, like you were saying, the great man narrative allows us to pick up all of these amazing and interesting stories and entree points and sort of nuggets of information that are just delightful. And I think that people, and now maybe that's me, maybe because I'm a history addict, I'm like, everybody doesn't love history? What? But I think history is really interesting. And I think if we treat history maybe like a little bit less preciously when it comes to like how we talk about it, and a little bit more like, let's be real about it, I think that that is a great way for kids, because kids can sort of sense BS too, you know, like, so if we're trying to feed them a narrative that isn't working for them, I don't blame them for not going for it, you know. But I think that there are so many amazing stories, so I'm keen to hear what you think.
Yeah, and also too, like I do get somewhat annoyed sometimes with the I guess the cultural reports for representation in media, particularly like in TV and movies. You know, representation behind the scenes is vital, but you know, representation on screen, like, okay, it's cool. Right. But representation historically, so I think it is an underdeveloped part of this conversation, because, you know, again, we going back to the great man, you know, dynamic. And it's like, well, if I feel like if young people who weren't, you know, cisgender men learned or knew that actually it wasn't just men who were resisting, who were leading, who were fighting, who were doing all this stuff. There are women, there are queer people, there were children, you know, people your age who were also part of resistance movements, then it would be a much more attractive entry point to history, and also to just, you know, wanting to dive deeper and have a greater understanding of the past. Whereas again, if we continue to just compartmentalize it into, okay, it's this one man journey, this one person journey, this very linear, very sanitized, you know, version of the story, then, you know, yeah, you might study some stuff and ace a quiz, but are you really invested? Are you really interested? Or are you as interested as you would be if you learn that there are people who look just like you know, who also had a hand in doing these things that only were thought to be the province of great men.
Absolutely. Although I'm not sure how young you think I am, but I'm into it.
Well, you
years of grad
when I
school,
say you, it wasn't like you, it was you as like speaking to the children.
Well, I'm taking children, me personally. Thank you.
I was speaking to the children who were on this book talk. I politics and prose right now. All right, next question. Yes. Okay, from I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Tamila. Tamila Gordon. What part of the book, Tamila? What part of the book? Oh, there's someone you know. What part of the book was the most emotionally taxing to research?
That is tough. I think there's two ways to look at emotionally taxing, right? Like on the one hand, some of the things that one has to actually describe as the conditions aboard these ships are so much more horrific than folks ever were willing to say before, that it's appalling. I'm not a person who gets visual images. I know how that goes around the internet a million times, and I'm very glad for that in the case of writing this book, because there's no time for aphantasia than when you have to like describe the fact that they would leave people who were sick of dysentery and still alive on the deck, but unmoving for so long that their skin would literally slough off because of the movement of a ship. And that's like basic, right? So that's awful. And so doing that every day a lot was not fun at all. But on the other hand, I think the part for me that genuinely is the most emotionally taxing is the part where you keep reading it and going, but why? Like, why couldn't, what? Why? And it was so, I was so frustrated every time the Admiralty made basically any decision. It was just like, they could, because it seemed like they were running this campaign as if they wanted to not win. They wanted to lose, or at least make it go on forever, which was nonsensical in some degrees and in some ways, but in other ways makes a lot of sense, because if once we get to William IV, at least, which is very close to the end of Black Joke's tenure, when he was Duke of Clarence, I believe he argued against banning the slave trade in the first place, against in the House of Lords. So when the regent isn't really that into it, it's not really going to happen. But even before that, a lot of the decisions made by sort of the policymakers in this case, or sort of the bridge between the policymakers, if we want to call that, like, you know, Parliament, and then the folks who are actually on the ground doing it. So middle management, the admins of this, was the part where a lot of it fell down. And interestingly enough, on the diplomacy side, a lot of it is really interesting and actually somewhat more positive, but then we dive deep into colonialism. But when it comes to practicality, I think for me, honestly, the most taxing thing is watching people steadily just doing their very best to not win, like just snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory at every possible choice. And I think that that just drove me wild, because it was just so frustrating.
Yeah. I don't even have
Sorry, that was a big answer. I was just like,
yeah, no. That's and I mean, I'm still honestly just taken by the imagery that you started with that you began your answer with, and just the horror of that, having to think about that and having to experience that.
Yeah.
Right. That's just wow.
Like, I am my ancestors. If you made it, if you didn't, forget it. You went through it, and I'll take it. Good for you. Because, like, not the white ones, but but yeah, because it's just like, I think, like, discovering that slave ships were so filthy, like so incredibly unerringly beyond filthy, and we're not just talking fluids, we're talking insects and animals and all of this stuff, that they could be smelled from a half a mile to a mile away from port. That's how dirty it was. Like, forget it. What do you even do with that information at that point? Because can you imagine how rank something has to be on open water and still smellable from a mile away?
Yeah, I mean, and it just reinforces the idea that they treated them like they were transporting, in like livestock.
Oh, absolutely. There's definitely a case of a guy who the ship, they were running low on supplies for whatever reason.
Worse even than they would treat livestock. Yeah.
Yeah, they were running low on supplies. They hit like some doldrums. There's some calms. I don't think this is a story that's actually in there. But the captain was like being enterprising, was like, well, we don't have enough money or we don't have enough food, supplies, whatever, for everyone anyway. So he just basically chucked like a third of the enslaved people he had over the side and then tried to claim the insurance for it. Okay. So you run into that, or it's like the entire ship got ophthalmia, so nobody could see anything, and they accidentally wandered into port like 7 months later, and like half of everyone was dead. And you're just like, it's just, everything about it is so much more horrific than I think we think it is.
So did you watch Barry Jenkins' adaptation of the Underground Railroad?
I have seen a couple episodes, but then I was like, you know what? I'm gonna need to take like some mental health days on this.
Yeah, like it. Like Barry's work is always amazing, and this was one of the best series that I've ever seen. In terms of the production value and the acting and the performances, the music, everything, cinematography, which is stellar. But as great as it is, I have trouble recommending it to people just because of how hard it is to watch.
Mm-hmm.
And now, obviously, you watch a film that's about slavery, and it's going to be hard to watch. But this, I feel like, was the hardest slave related depiction that I have seen, and I've seen a lot of them. 12 Years a Slave and Amistad and Roots and Glory, which wasn't really that hard to watch,
but it does
but
make me weep, like ridiculously.
but yeah, it was definitely melodramatic and also had great music too. Glory had great music. And so I'm wondering if that has come up with you, like when, yes, we want people to know these histories, right? And we want these stories to be told, but they're also, definitely has to be a trigger warning with these stories. Like, you're gonna read this, and if you read it, it's gonna be inside of you, and it's gonna make you feel terribly while you're doing that. And so how do you reconcile that feeling with, hey, I want everyone to read my book, but but at the same time, you're it's this great history, you need to know this, but you're also at some point going to feel extremely as shitty as you've ever felt before.
It is tough. And honestly, I have had multiple people who, like, friends or whatever, like, I got your book. And I'm like, great. And they're like, I'm going to read it really soon. And I'm like, I don't know if that's going to be as quick as you think it is. And not because like their reading prowess or anything like that, but because it is a hard story. And also I tend to provide a lot of information. So it's a lot. But mostly because it's a really difficult story. And I think that there are a lot of points where one might just be like, you know what, I'm going to need to take a little pause on that and just let that sit for a minute. And I respect that, honestly. Like, as much as I love selling books, buy all your books from Politics and Prose. But as much as I love selling books, like, I'm also a librarian, right, on the inside. So to me, it really matters to make knowledge accessible. Right. And that's what it really comes down to for me personally. And so one of the things that I hope I did, that I tried to do when I was doing the research for this, is that I went afield. If you talked about the Black joke, the slave trade, anything in the late Georgian era, like right here, Boston Clippers, whatever, Baltimore Clippers rather, I found you and I looked you up and I probably read your dissertation. But people aren't going to do that. Right? Like, that's what I think is fun. That is not what everybody thinks is fun. Right. And because people aren't going to do that, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have an entry point to all of this amazing knowledge that has been produced by these, like, dozens to hundreds of historians or preserved by archivists or whatever. And so to me, it becomes really important to put all of that somewhere where it becomes like, here's a thing that you can hold in your hand that basically gives you the story, right? And obviously there are 8 bajillion other things to explore, but you have access to this information now in a way that's not sort of geared toward an academic audience or hidden behind a paywall. It's here. And so to me, once that happens, if you can get to it, then I feel a lot better about that, regardless of how quickly you do in fact read it. Because I don't think anybody, if you read it quickly, great, like, I'm not judging you, but I do think that there are a lot of folks who won't, and I think that there are plenty of good reasons for that.
This question is from Joe Paynes. I saw in your bio that you actually study sex. Does any of that work show up in this book?
Yes. We definitely
I like how you changed you had your sex question answer voice just now. It's like, oh yes,
it does.
Yes, it does.
So, but yeah, no, it does. Obviously what we talked about earlier with look up HMS AFRICAINE. So you guys have so much homework from this book talk. I am so sorry. We're making you look up all the things. But so W.E.B. Du Bois's infographics, and now the HMS African, because it is one of the wildest stories I think I have maybe just ever read in military history. I was like, I could not believe it. So one, that does. So for folks who either got on later or whatever, what happened on the HMS African basically is that there was a large homosexual subcommunity sort of hidden in plain sight, and hidden is real relative. And then eventually they are quote unquote discovered, and it ends up being a major court-martialing thing. Many people are punished, at least 4 people are executed, and several people are sent to Newgate, I believe. And the ship itself is burned. So like the Admiralty, the Royal Navy was not having it. Buggery was a capital punishment, earning offense, but in order to prove buggery, you had to actually have an emission. It could not simply be penetration, which is a very different way of thinking about sex than we have today. So that's already interesting. And then another place, although it's not that big, but I always find it very amusing, is the fact that one of my sources mentioned, and it came up again in opposing the slavers, but a primary source mentioned that these guys really had a hard time getting laid in Africa. African women were completely disinterested. So they were like, what? And then like that, they're like, no, thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you. And it was like such an issue that apparently St. Helena, which had been sort of colonized and whatnot for a while, was like one of the only places, and maybe Ascension, were some of the only places where sailors could be assured of being able to purchase the company to get their rocks off in whatever way they saw fit. Because it was on the coast of Africa? Nah, son, they were not having it. So I was like, what? Tell me. And of course, like the writer is like, I can't believe they don't like our fair English features. But they did not. And they apparently made that evident, because even the Commodore wrote a letter to the Admiralty basically saying that this island is the only place where the men can take relaxation.
So basically, those were the first incels. Is that what you're saying?
Or they were having sex on board, right? Like we have like some early instances of potentially don't ask, don't tell. We have some very involuntary celibates potentially. So yeah, there's a lot of sort of sexual shenanigans going on. But always that's really difficult with older sources, because infrequently do they sort of come out and make it plain, as much as that one guy did about the situation. Usually they're just sort of like, it was a friend, or so and so died a bachelor, tend to be like the sort of euphemisms. And I actually use one of those for Downs because I am unsure of what his orientation is. So rather than say anything or speculate, he did die a bachelor. That is all I know.
Okay. What did the U.S. government think of the Black joke? Did it make it into any of the newspapers of the time?
It did. It was actually quite famous. It was famous on all 3 points of the triangle, if you will. And there are U.S. sources that write about the existence of the Black joke. So it was actually pretty well known around, just because 1, it was a very fast ship. 2, it was almost certainly American built, right? So, which was illegal, by the way, because the only ship we know of that was built during the same era was in 1825, which is the Griffin, which was built for Pedro I of Brazil. But fun fact, supporting or supplying the international slave trade in any way had technically been illegal in the United States since, I believe, 1794. Oops. But all of these shipwrights somehow, well, when they eventually decide to start tightening up on some of these laws and then enforcing them, you have like a cadre of shipwrights from the sort of Baltimore Chesapeake region who end up going down to the Caribbean and sort of continuing their trade. But so they thought about it. Did they do nothing? No, not really. The United States decided they weren't going to really get involved in slave trade suppression. Technically, it was authorized from the beginning, and they did have a very tiny force, very tiny, eventually. But random fun fact is that the slave trade here, the illegal international slave trade to the United States, not only increased in the decade before the Civil War, but if I recall correctly, New York was considered basically the hub of the international slave trade at that point, because it was mostly suppressed everywhere by the late 1950s, or 1850s.
Yeah. Well, okay. Let me think, what next? What was the weirdest thing you found while you were researching this book in terms of archival materials, evidence?
Oh.
And evidence in the last place you were expecting, an odd artifact, that sort of thing.
Okay. Well,
and that's from Whitney Thompson. I'm sorry.
Oh, hi, Whitney. One thing I think would be, what is the best? That is so tough. Well, one thing that I know exists that I think is really, really fascinating is Downes's logbook. Unlike most of the other, well, which may be in the archives. That's the problem with writing a book during COVID. But I know where Downes's logbook is because I've actually seen it. And, intellectual property being what it is, I can show no images from my research of it. But inside, it has a number of very interesting things, including there's a little key of like common words translated to be able to try to speak sort of a pidgin African language kind of thing to the enslaved. So there was that. So that's interesting, right? But they actually wrote 2 sea shanties about the El Almirante action that were just hiding in there. So it's like, I was like, I don't think I discovered these sea shanties, but they're sort of delightful. And one of them is very long. Like it's rhyming couplets throughout and they're in the footnotes. But so I think either the shanties or the language key, or even the fact that Downes was just an artist. So if you ever get to go to the National Maritime Museum and the Caird Library in Greenwich, I don't know why, but international dateline, maybe. So you're already in Greenwich anyway, because you wanted to stand on both sides. Maybe that's it. Or Greenwich Mean, because the international dateline's on the other side of the country, world. Anyway, point being, this didn't go well in the last minute. But Downes was an artist. So he left us little sketches of like the interior of the Black Joke and how everything was laid out. And I drew a picture of El Almirante because they stared at it long enough to be able to do so. And so I think it's really cool to sort of be able to see these things that these people sort of touched and handled and sort of whatnot. And especially when there's nothing left of the ship, except a snuff box.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left. Now, would you mind going a little bit longer so we get through these questions, or do you have a hard out at 7? Okay,
I am
we
here.
Go about 5 or 10 minutes long, because you asked a really good question today, and I want to make sure we get through all of them. Not a lot, but
I will do shorter answers, and I will be, your time is valuable because I appreciate your staying over as well. So let's go.
This is from Francis Walters. Is there anything you couldn't fit into the book that you would recommend that people read more about?
Oh, yes. There's a lot. Let's see, quick hits. One story that I didn't include that I was reminded of by a scholar named Dave Blair, who I cite his dissertation a couple of times from Georgetown. And he reminded me of the fact that during the El Almirante action, an enslaved child falls off of the ship as they're shooting at it. And 2 crewmen from the Black Joke dive in, swim to the kid, scoop it up, and then make it back to the Black Joke alive and successfully. Kid's okay. And the super interesting part about that is that they were probably the only people on board who could swim, because the Admiralty or the Royal Navy made it a policy to not teach sailors to swim, so they could not leave their ships. Whoops. So you end up with a situation with a lot of white people who cannot swim and a lot of Black people who can.
There's so many like historical laws and mores and regulations that you just like, what? So you want them to just drown on the sea?
I know. It is the wildest. I'm like, you don't want to teach sailors
how to swim.
Are we sure? And like, it drove me so wild that I like went through every source I could find until I figured out when they changed the policy. And I think it was Brian Lavery who wrote about it, maybe. But I think they changed the policy sometime in the 1830s, and you're just like, oh, that is wild. But yeah, okay. So.
Yeah, we want snipers who can't see.
Right.
That's somewhat ableist. I shouldn't have said that. But yeah, it's ridiculous that
it seems like the basic life-saving thing, but no, apparently not. Fall in the water, you're toast. Enjoy that. But I think, there's a huge history of swimmers and divers apparently on the coast of Africa, particularly in that area pre-contact and whatnot. So there were some really interesting sources about that. Enslaved swimmers and divers. Yes, I came back to answering the question. So I think that there is a lot more about that could be included. That's really great. France and their history with abolishing the slave trade. It's real complicated and it's not particularly cute. Honestly, more about the United States relationship to it, if it had fit, I think would have been interesting just to sort of help people see what was happening here that was different than what was happening there. But there's so many, there's so much stuff. Please mine all the sources. There's so much information in there. It's fabulous, and also terrible.
Any plans for a children's version of this book, like the 1619 Projects Born on the Water?
I never, honestly, I'm not gonna lie, I never contemplated a children's version of this book. It's real tough.
There you go.
Because there's a lot of international diplomacy stuff that's a little not maybe the most interesting, but maybe there's a way to do it. But a lot of it
could be,
is
yeah, I think there could be a way to do that with you know, you just tell one particular story, and I think The Black Joke is a really great title right there alone. And yeah, you tell a story and you don't have to tell the whole story.
That's
you could,
true.
you know, a picture book.
I needed to have this conversation to be able to even think about it, because I was like, childless. What do children even read? I don't know. So now I'm like, well, now I'm thinking about it. Thank you.
think of it as revenue stream. Think of it that way.
That's right.
Revenue stream.
Teach children.
I think what else?
I just saw a friend say in the chat that I could borrow her kids. Thank you, Megan.
Michael White wants to know if you're in the DC area, because he would love to hear you again live, or where can
I am not.
they find a schedule of your speaking engagements?
I am not in the DC area at all. Although I was supposed to be. Omicron would not let any of us be great. So it was supposed to happen. But I'm doing another one of these with an amazing professor friend of mine, Marlena Edwards, who teaches at Penn State in African diaspora at Browse About Books, and then another one at Book Bar in Denver. So from talking perspective, that's about all you got for me. But I'm not telling you to buy any books from those people. I'm telling you to only buy books from these people. Because otherwise I think that would be bad. So you can come see me talk another time on the 26th or the 31st. Oh, no more information.
Okay, and I think the last question we'll get to tonight is, how long did it take you to research this?
I honestly, some days I don't feel like I'm done. Some days I'm like, you know what? Did I actually find that article? But honestly, I guess about a year and a half. I think that was probably about right. I think writing time was a little closer to 2, but yeah, I'd say about a year and a half. So it was definitely a lot. God bless institutional access. I wish I had more of it still, but it is what it is. So HathiTrust, honestly, being digital and like freely accessible during that period was probably the greatest thing that could have happened to researching this book. And Wendy's here, so I will just.
Oh, actually, you know what? I lied. There is one more question I want to get to.
Please,
and
go.
This is from Camille Chapman, who wants you to provide the full name of Mr. Kim that you reference and I guess the title of his book. You made a reference to a book probably about 45 minutes ago, and I don't know if it was clear.
Somebody tell me. And then because Kim is not ringing a bell. Sorry.
Was it the suppression of the African slave trade?
That would be W.E.B. Du Bois.
Okay.
Ray Costello is the one about black sailors. Mary Wills is attitudes of British sailors while they're doing this. Peter Grindle is an entire overview of all of this stuff. Sawade Muscatine is Slavery at Sea, which is the Mustakim rather, which is the stuff on board, as well as Marcus Rydecker. If you wanted more about pirates in the 17th century and other attitudes towards slavery, there's also Line Boss / Rydecker's Many-Headed Hydra, and I could definitely keep going. So
or
let me know what it was about.
Another alternative, one could buy the book.
Or buy the book, sorry.
And look in the bibliography. Just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know
better at this.
if you've seen in the chat, you have a lot of friends who are offering their children to you. Lots of people.
There are children. So, and then my mother just apparently is also here. So mom, don't listen to any of them. No grandchildren for you. You have to keep the grandchildren you have from the siblings. I do not accept any of those people's children except to have fun with them and babysit for them and then make them have a children's book, apparently, which I didn't know I needed to do, but apparently now I do. I got
revenue stream.
Focus groups in the comments already. How can I say no?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I would definitely
5
first day purchase. Yeah, definitely.
That's amazing. All right, all of your kids. I'll take all of them. Mail me your children.
All right, y'all. Well, Damon, Rooks, thank you so much again. Black joke. Look at that. I feel like Vanna White, the black joke. Here we go. Bye, the black joke. Thank you both. And thank you everyone who was on today. This recording is going to be archived on YouTube, so you can watch it again and again and again and again. And there's one more thing Rooks wants to say.
I also just wanted to add my thanks not only to you and Politics and Prose and the union, but also absolutely to Damon, to Zainab, you know what happened, and to everyone who sort of made this event happen. I super appreciate it, and I super appreciate your time more than anything, especially Damon, who had to read it beforehand. So,
all right, with that, be well, stay warm.
All right, this was great. Thanks, everyone.
See you guys.
Have a great night.
Bye-bye.